to look out at a hall so full of people. I've been doing meetings like this up and down the country now for months, I think, and I've come to the conclusion that we are going through in Scotland a real revival of democracy. It's absolutely wonderful, and I hope whatever side of this debate you're on, if you're leaning towards yes or leaning towards no, or like many people still undecided, regardless of that, I hope you take a great deal of pride in being here and in being part of the wonderful process that we're all engaged in. Whatever the outcome of the referendum in 4 and a bit weeks' time, and I don't think I'm letting you into any secrets by telling you that I hope that is a yes, but whatever the outcome of the referendum, something very special has happened in Scottish democracy that I think will leave a long-lasting legacy, and all of you in being here tonight are playing your part in that. The most important aspect of the meeting we're having here tonight is the question and answer session that we'll get on to very shortly. And right up front tonight, I want to say to you very clearly that you should feel free to ask me any question that you want to, and I will do my level best to answer that question for you. Quite often at the end of these meetings I get a wee queue of people waiting to speak to me, which you're very welcome to do incidentally, but often I get people coming up to speak to me at the end saying, I wanted to ask you a question about this or that, but I didn't want to do it in front of everybody in case people thought it was a stupid question. Well, there is no such thing as a stupid question in this debate. If it's something that is on your mind, if it's something that's important to you, if it is something that you just want to know the answer to and haven't heard the answer to yet, and particularly if it's something that's going to have a bearing on how you decide to vote on the 18th of September, then it's an important question. And if it is important to you, then it's important to me to get an opportunity to answer your question. So please feel free to ask me whatever you want. I've got no doubt that we'll have a broad and diverse range of questions this evening on a range of detailed and very specific topics: currency, the economy, how we pay for public services if we're an independent country, defence, the European Union, all of these things and many, many more I'm sure will feature in our discussion this evening. But before we get to that point, what I want to do is take just a few minutes to set out for you the general case, as I see it, for Scotland becoming a normal, independent country. Now, I use that word normal very deliberately when I'm making this case, and the reason I use that word is that, although, as I've just said a moment or so ago, we're engaged in a process in Scotland that, if not unique, is quite unusual. We're one of very few countries that have had the opportunity to consider whether or not we want to become independent entirely peacefully and entirely democratic. We're not having to fight each other for the privilege, we're not having to see a single drop of blood shed in the process, and we're all privileged as a result of that. So the process is not unique, but not entirely commonplace. But what is commonplace and not unusual at all is countries choosing to become independent. You know, back at the end of the Second World War, there were around 50 independent countries in the world. Today there are around 200 independent countries in the world. So over that period, 60 years or so, 150 countries have made the decision to do what we are contemplating doing now, which is to become independent. So becoming independent is not unusual. Being independent is certainly not unusual. It is the normal state of affairs for countries the world over, which is why I talk about Scotland becoming a normal, independent country. And that's the case I'm going to make to you this evening. I'm going to make that case with reference to the two big questions I get asked most often as I travel around the country speaking to meetings like this, chapping on people's doors, not during Coronation Street if I can possibly avoid it, and engaging in this debate. And those two big questions are these ones. Firstly, can we really do this as a country? Is Scotland big enough? Are we strong enough? Are we rich enough to stand on our own 2 feet and be an independent country? And secondly, why should we do it? What are the benefits of being independent? What difference will it make to our lives here in Scotland? What difference will it make to the country and to all of us who call Scotland home and live here? So these are the two questions I'm going to, as briefly as possible, seek to answer for you this evening before making some concluding observations and then getting on to the business of you interrogating me for the remainder of the meeting here tonight. So that first question, can we really do this? That's a very legitimate question, it's an important question. I'd go as far as to say it's a pretty fundamental question. Because if I can't convince you tonight that Scotland's got what it takes to be independent, I'm not going to get very far in trying to convince you that we should take this opportunity to become independent. So it's an important question. Notwithstanding that though, I sometimes reflect on the fact that it's quite an odd question for a country like Scotland to be asking ourselves. Scotland is a small country, relatively speaking, not the smallest country in the world by any stretch of the imagination, but relatively speaking, a small country. But that's only in terms of our size and our population. In the contribution Scotland has made to the world down the generations, we're anything but small. You know, Scotland's made a massive, some may say disproportionate contribution to the world down the years, the decades, the generations. I read a book a few years ago which I would recommend if anybody's looking for something to read. It was a book by a Canadian guy called Arthur Herman, and the title of the book is How Scots Invented the Modern World. And when you think about it, that's not too much of an exaggeration. Think about all of the big inventions and innovations of the ages, from the television, the telephone, penicillin, ultrasound, tarmac, the overdraft. Apparently Scotland invented the overdraft. I've never said we should boast about all of these inventions. More recently, you know, the biggest scientific innovation of our lifetimes may be cloning. Dolly the sheep, developed here in Scotland. Even more recently, and this is a wee test I always set these audiences, Grand Theft Auto. How many people here have played Grand Theft Auto? Come on. A few hands, but anyway. Computer game, take the world by storm, developed here in Scotland by a company in Edinburgh. So what point am I making here? Scotland is a country that has punched above its weight, contributed massively to the world, and yet we still ask ourselves, do we have what it takes to be an independent country? Well, I'm here tonight to tell you that yes, we absolutely do. Scotland was independent today, we would be the 14th richest country in the world. Now, how do we measure that? Well, the standard measurement of the wealth of a country is to add up everything its economy produces in a year, divide it by the number of people who live here, and that gives you a gross domestic product per head of population. By that measurement, Scotland would be the 14th richest country in the developed world, richer than countries like Japan, France, the United Kingdom itself. The UK is the 18th richest country in the world, which is not a bad position to be in by any stretch of the imagination, but an independent Scotland would be 4 places above that. Interestingly, when you look at the countries that make up the top 10 richest countries in the world, what you find are that many of them are countries with many similarities to Scotland. The Norways, the Denmarks, the Swedens of this world, proving that being small is no barrier at all to being prosperous and successful as a country. So we are, without a shadow of a doubt, one of the richest countries in the world. Sometimes when I say that, though, I get met with what I've come to describe as the but response, which I often think is a typically Scottish response to being told good news. But there's always a flaw in whatever good news we're being told. But the but response here tends to be, but that's all about oil. If you take oil out of the equation, then Scotland's no longer one of the richest countries in the world, and we wouldn't be rich enough to be independent. Well, that's also not true. Oil is very important in our economy. Most independent countries, most successful independent countries, don't have oil reserves. We do, and we are very lucky to have them. But oil's not the basis of our economy, it's a bonus in our economy. We're lucky to have many strengths to our economy, many strings to our economic bow. So we've got a food and drink industry that earns us around about £13 billion every year, that exports all over the globe. Advanced manufacturing that earns us about £15 billion every year. We've got a tourism industry that thrives despite our dodgy weather. We've got a renewable energy industry. We're lucky as a country, we didn't just win the natural lottery once, and oil and gas, we won it twice because we've got Europe's biggest potential in renewable energy. We're world leaders in life sciences. So we're a rich country, and it's not all about oil. We've got real strength and depth economically. And the last point I want to make to you on this question is one point I would, of all the things I will say to you tonight, ask you to take away and remember every time you hear somebody on the no side of this debate saying something like, Scotland can't be independent because we couldn't afford to pay for our National Health Service or our pensions or our social security system. And what I want you to remember the next time you hear that is this: Scotland is not subsidised in any way, shape or form. There is no money tree sits down in Westminster growing free money to send up to Scotland to pay for things. All of these things that we enjoy and depend on are paid for by us, by the taxes we pay, by the national insurance contributions we make. Right now that money goes to the Treasury in London, and the Treasury in London decides how much of it finds its way back to Scotland. With independence we pay the same taxes and national insurance contributions, but that money stays in Scotland, and we in Scotland decide the priority for the allocation and the spending of that money. So there's my first pitch, if you like, to you this evening. We can do this. We're a rich country with a strong and diverse economy, and we're not subsidised. We stand on our own 2 feet and we pay our way. So, however you decide to vote, if on the 18th of September, and I hope this is not the case, but if on the 18th of September you decide for whatever reason not to vote yes, and every one of us will make that decision in our own way for our own reasons, and that is what happens in a democracy, and that's fine. So if you decide not to vote yes, my plea to you, and it is a plea from my heart, is don't let it be because somebody somewhere has managed to convince you that Scotland doesn't have what it takes to stand on our own 2 feet as an independent country, because nothing, absolutely nothing, could be further from the truth. The second question, though, I want to address, I think is the much bigger and better question. Why should we do this? What are the benefits of being independent? The reason we should be independent, in my view, boils down to something very simple. It will always be better, without exception in my opinion, for decisions about Scotland, decisions that shape the future of our country, that determine how successful we are, how prosperous we are, how fair our society is. It will always be better for those decisions to be taken here in Scotland by us, by people who live here, people who work here, people who run businesses here, who raise their families here. That will always be better than having those decisions taken 600 miles away by politicians in London who very often we haven't even voted for. And that is the essence of the argument for independence. It puts us in control of our own future as a country. Now, it doesn't mean we will always get those decisions right. Every country makes mistakes. Every country has its ups and downs and faces its challenges. Independence is not a magic wand that waves away all of Scotland's problems and challenges. That's not what I'm here tonight to try to convince you of. And anybody who does try to tell you that independence is a magic wand, they should be treated just as dismissively as the person who tries to tell you Scotland's too poor to be independent. It's not a magic wand, but it is a massive opportunity. A massive opportunity to put into our hands access to our resources, the decisions about how those resources are spent, to put into our hands the levers of decision-making power that ultimately determine what kind of country we are. Let me just give you 2 quick examples of the difference that can make. If we get the chance to control our own economic policy, we can design that policy to ensure that we are implementing the measures that encourage more businesses to locate in Scotland, to expand in Scotland, to create jobs and opportunities for people in Scotland, instead of having to have the situation that we have just now of every year watching around 40,000 of our young people leave Scotland. Now, many young people will opt to leave because they want to see the world and spread their wings, and that is absolutely fine. But I don't want young people to have to leave because we don't have the economic clout to implement the policies that create the opportunities for them to stay here. And secondly, we get the chance to decide for ourselves what kind of social security and welfare system we have. One that helps people into work but provides a decent safety net for those who can. Instead of the situation we've got just now where we're watching more and more people plunged into poverty. Your children's charities say that if we stay as we are in Scotland, we're going to see 100,000 more children living in poverty by the year 2020 because of policies being implemented by Westminster. I visited a food bank in Glasgow a week ago today. Food bank demand in Scotland has increased by 400% in the space of a year. We're a rich country, it shouldn't be that way. So these are the kinds of decisions and opportunities that open up for us if we're independent, that remain closed if we're not. So that's my case for Scotland being an independent country. And if we don't take that opportunity, what happens? Well, we continue to, on occasion, watch big decisions about the future of our country and all of us who live here being taken by governments in Westminster that sometimes, if we're lucky, we voted for. But very often, as is the case now, we haven't. You know, I'm 44 years old, significantly younger than Brendan. And you were meant to gasp in horror when I said that incidentally. But never once in my life has Scotland collectively, as a country, voted Conservative. But for more than half my life, we've had a Conservative government. Now that sounds like an anti-Tory point, and I'm fairly anti-Tory, it has to be said. But that's not really an anti-Tory point, it's a pro-democracy point. Parties that win the elections in any country should become the government, not the parties that lose elections. So if we're independent, we get the governments we collectively vote for, and we don't have to put up with governments that we don't. So that's the case for us being an independent country. In just over 4 weeks' time, we have a massive opportunity. It's an opportunity we might never get again. I know there will be many, many, many people in Scotland, as they go into the polling station, many of them to vote yes will do so with a sense of nervousness, a little bit of fear, uncertainty. Are we doing the right thing? What big decision do we ever take in our lives where we don't have that sense? But it's the right thing to do, in my opinion, because it puts the future of our country into our own hands. So I hope we don't pass up the opportunity. We might not get it again. We've got the opportunity to take responsibility for building a better country for all of us lucky enough to be alive right now, but more importantly, for our children, for our grandchildren, and for generations to come. That's what it's all about, which is why I so hope we take the opportunity that we've got before us. Thank you very much.
Okay, now it's your turn. As I say, I'll take the questions in batches of 3. So if you, now what I will say is, please, no speeches. We want to get as many genuine questions. So if you are planning to make a speech, please don't. First hand up is the lady there, and then the gentleman halfway up, and the gentleman at the front.
Regarding the currency, it was okay for Ireland to keep the pound, and indeed it was okay for Australia and New Zealand to have it for 20 odd years. What's the big deal of us not being able to keep it?
Well, I'll stick with the currency issue. I was reading on a website called Lawyers for Yes, where one Brandon Malone, who is a Yes supporter, came out and said that the pound does belong to the rest of the UK in the event of independence. You should see it, I'm sure Nicolas probably already read it. It's called Lawyers for Yes. He's called Brandon Malone. And so I don't think that there isn't a possibility of a sterling zone, but I think that that the yes side should come out and admit the legal position. The pound does not belong to Scotland in the case of independence.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman there?
Yeah, I have a question about the economy of Scotland post-independence. If you add up all the contributing amounts, you see that the food industries and the entertainment industries and everything else actually only make up about less than 1% of the oil and gas industry. My concern is that the oil and gas industry is a very finite business. We're already working into very difficult ways of extracting gas and oil, like fracking. How much length of time, or what length of time is there that is going to be such a vast, important part of Scotland's wealth? How long is it going to be around for?
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for those questions. Let me deal with currency first, and I'll deal with both questions together. I do know Brandon Malone. I'm not entirely sure what particular piece of writing you're referring to, but I'll have a look at it later on. But your question will be encapsulated in the answer I'm going to give. Yes, no, I know who he is. I don't want to quote something that I've not seen in internet. Anyway, I will answer the question without reference to that particular point. We take just a little bit of time on currency because it is such an important issue. People have a right to know what currency they'll be using when Scotland becomes an independent country. A couple of years ago, the Scottish Government asked a group of economists, very eminent international economists, to look at the range of currency options that an independent Scotland would have. And there are a range of options. We can use the pound as part of a formal currency union, which is what the Scottish Government proposes. You could use the pound informally, outside that kind of formal arrangement. You can have your own currency, either pegged to sterling or free-floating, or you can go into the euro, something that the Scottish Government has ruled out and is not, I don't believe many people in Scotland would favour that option. So the Fiscal Commission, which is what the group of economists were called, looked at all of these options and looked at the pros and cons of them all. You can, if you're interested enough and have the inclination to do so, you can go onto the Scottish Government website and read their report. They recommended using the pound within a formal monetary union, and the Scottish Government have accepted that recommendation, and that's what we argue for. And in just a second I want to come back and set out some of the reasons why we consider that that option is in the best interest of Scotland, obviously, but secondly, that option is also in the best interest of the rest of the UK. But before I do that, let me just refer to the lady's point. Because you're absolutely correct, no country in the world can be prevented from using the pound. The pound is, in economic jargon, what's called an internationally traded currency. In everybody else's language, that just means any country can use the pound. As you rightly pointed out, when Ireland became independent from Britain, it used the pound for a significant period of time before Ireland opted to have its own currency, and of course Ireland subsequently went into the euro. When Australia became independent from Britain, it used the pound as well until it opted to have its own currency. So, regardless of what George Osborne or any other aspiring Chancellor might say, no country, including Scotland, can be prevented from using the pound. And, of course, I would argue, this goes to your point, sir, albeit I will read what you're referring me to later on this evening. I think it's Scotland's pound as much as it is the pound of any other part of the UK. We've contributed to the building up of that asset and the asset that backs it in terms of the Bank of England, which is a nationalised institution, just as much as any other part of the UK. So nobody can stop Scotland from using the pound if Scotland chooses to use the pound. We propose using the pound in a formal arrangement, a formal currency union. I want to just give you 3 reasons why continuing to share currency with Scotland is in the best interest of the rest of the UK. Now, I'm taking it as read that we think it's in the best interest of Scotland, and the main reason for that is that England is our biggest export market. It would make no sense to ask and expect our companies to change money to trade with England. But that applies in reverse as well. So the first reason why it makes sense for the rest of the UK is that Scotland is England's second biggest export market. If Scotland and England weren't sharing a currency, then a very conservative estimate of the cost that would be incurred by English businesses to trade with Scotland would be £500 million every year. Now, I don't think a Chancellor at Westminster is going to be very popular if they turn around and say to businesses in England that they're going to have to pay effectively an unnecessary tax of £500 million every year. Secondly, if we're in a currency union, the value of Scotland's exports, which amount to about £100 billion a year, continue to count towards the UK's balance of payments. You'll have heard the term balance of payments, the difference between a country imports and exports. If the value of our exports don't count towards the UK's balance of payments, then the rest of the UK's trade deficit goes up. And why is that important? Well, that's one of the things that impacts on the value of a country's currency. So if the rest of the UK's trade deficit is going up, then that will have an impact on the value of sterling. And I don't think people across England are going to be happy at going on holiday and finding they can buy less with the pound in their pocket because their Chancellor has taken an irrational decision about sharing the pound with Scotland. And finally, and this does come very much to the point about who owns the pound, who owns the Bank of England. The Bank of England is a shared asset. Now, if the position of the rest of the UK, which I don't believe it will be if we're in this situation, is that Scotland is not entitled to a fair share of assets that we have jointly contributed to, then the other side of that coin, if you pardon the pun, is that Scotland wouldn't presumably take a fair share of liabilities either. And Westminster will want Scotland to pay a fair share of the UK's national debt, because it's quite big. The UK's national debt is £1.5 trillion. Scotland's share of that, the interest charges on Scotland's share every year is about £5 billion. Now, Westminster's legally responsible for the debt, the Treasury's confirmed that. We want to pay a share, but you would only do that if you were getting fairness around assets as well. So for the UK to continue with the position that Westminster are taking right now would end up saddling taxpayers in the rest of the UK with higher debt servicing charges than is required. So for all of these reasons, we would be in a position of Westminster cutting off its nose to spite its face. And I don't think they're going to do that. So whatever you hear right now from politicians that, as is absolutely their right, are trying to persuade you to vote no, it will be very different after a yes vote, when I will confidently predict that Westminster politicians will be doing everything they can to persuade Scotland to continue to share the pound in a formal currency union. So that's taking some time to answer that, because it is such an important question. And my final point on it would be this. Of course I'm putting forward the view from the point of view of the Yes campaign. Listen to what I say, listen to what those on the other side of the campaign say, and make up your own mind what you think is the most rational, reasonable, common sense based position. You're all intelligent folk, you're all perfectly capable of doing that. I'm putting forward the position that I believe is common sense, it's rational, it's reasonable, and it's the one that will prevail if we vote yes in a few weeks' time. Now, sorry Brendan, I've gone on a bit about that, but I'm going to take the gentleman here's point about oil. A couple of quick points to make about oil, just in terms of the remaining oil reserves. There are estimated to be 24 billion barrels of recoverable oil left in the North Sea. The wholesale value of that is estimated to be about £1.5 trillion. By value, there's more to come out of the North Sea than has already been extracted. Now, obviously, what that translates into in terms of the number of years depends on speed of exploitation and extraction, but there is a significant asset there still to be extracted and exploited from the North Sea. The second point I would make is kind of related to the point I made in my opening remarks. Oil is important in the Scottish economy, and I'm not standing here suggesting anything other than that. But what I am saying is that we're not dependent on oil. If I give you a comparison, Scotland, Norway, countries similar in size, discovered oil around about the same time. Norway's oil revenues account for approximately 30% of its total tax revenues. In Scotland, the equivalent figure is half that, about 15%. So we're less dependent, if you want to use that word, on oil than Norway is. And yet you never hear anybody say Norway's not perfectly capable of being an independent country, because it's one of the most successful independent countries in the world. And my final point would be, yes, oil is a finite resource. There's a lot of it still to come. But what we should be doing for the remainder of the time that we have that resource is trying to steward it a little bit more responsibly. Norway, that I mentioned earlier on, has saved some of its oil revenues. It's got an oil fund, they call it their national pension fund. It will mean that after the oil's run out, they'll have the benefit of oil for years, generations to come. As part of the UK, we're one of only 2 oil-producing countries in the entire world that don't have an oil fund. The other one's Iraq, incidentally, which is not necessarily the best company to be keeping. So we've got a choice. We can't turn the clock back and undo the fact that we haven't saved some of those revenues, but we can make sure we don't make the same mistake in the future. And we can be fiscally responsible and try to save some of our revenues so that long after oil is gone, we've got something to show for it. And we don't become one of only 2 countries in the world that's got nothing to show our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren and their grandchildren for the fact that we were lucky enough to have oil as a country.
I'm a passionate yes supporter, and I'm also equally passionate about wanting to get rid of.
You're fine.
Also passionate about wanting to get rid of nuclear submarines, but I'm also a member of the Green Party. Nicola, would it not be better when Scotland becomes an independent country to use the undoubted transferable skills of some of the Translane workforce to exploit the undoubted potential of renewable energy off the west coast of Scotland, so that, as Jim Silla said last week, the west coast of Scotland could be the Aberdeen of the West, rather than, as Jim Silla suggested last week, this workforce could be used to exploit further reserves of oil now known to lie below the Firth of Clyde, thus contributing even greater to climate change.
Okay, thank you very much. Gentleman with the short.
I was just wanting to know how the removal of Trident is going to affect local jobs, the local economy and local businesses.
Okay, the gentleman there.
Sorry, David. Just to pick up exactly what you've been saying over the last half an hour or so. I read through a report last night, the Macron report from 1975. And in that report, it stated out exactly what you've been saying and what we've been saying now in the Yes campaign for many, many years. But also, one thing that's never been brought out by Westminster is the amount of oil off Arran. Now, this back in 1975 was discussed. And it was there, and the only thing that stopped that was the Ministry of Defence because of the submarines. And this is something I think we should be. I think it's very, very important to Scotland itself is the opening up of our ports. We've been depleted of all our ports in Scotland, and everything comes through England.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, these questions are all connected, so I'll wrap them all up in one answer in the interest of time, if that's okay. Rose, like you, I am a passionate supporter of independence and also very passionate about wanting to see nuclear weapons removed from Scotland and nuclear weapons removed from the world. I've been a member of I was a member of CND before I was ever a member of the SNP, so that's a principle that runs very deep within me. But I'm very conscious of the fact, and it goes to the question the gentleman asked secondly there, that I'm standing in a part of the country where the removal of Trident is not just something that is talked about in the abstract or in principle terms, but has very real implications and is therefore of concern. So I want to take a bit of time, once I've addressed the issues around Trident, to say something about Faslane and the future of the base here, which is important to people in this particular part of Scotland. Yes, the two questions about West Coast oil. Yes, I would like to see the supposed potential of West Coast oil properly explored and exploited, and if we can use transferable skills of people who currently work in Faslane or elsewhere to help do that, then all the better. That would be an added bonus. There has been, over a period of time, concern that the proper exploration of that has been not taken forward because of the presence of Trident nuclear submarines. I think it's important for as a country that all of our resources are properly stewarded. The Macron report, I mean, for those who are not familiar with the Macron report, it's a piece of work that was uncovered a few years back, done by a civil servant many years ago within the then Scottish office, that seemed to suggest that the value of Scotland's oil had been deliberately downplayed by Westminster governments to sort of stop or prevent a rise in support for independence. And I think, and we've had politicians like Dennis Healey more recently confirm that the value of oil was repeatedly downplayed. I think Westminster governments over the years have been less than frank with Scotland and the people of Scotland about what exactly the value of our oil is. And one of the things we've got to decide in this referendum is whether we're going to leave the stewardship of our oil in the hands of politicians of Westminster, or decide that we're going to steward it ourselves for the benefit of us and for generations to come. On the point about Trident and Faslane, as I've said, I want to see Trident removed from Scotland, and I'm not going to stand here because I'm in Helensburgh and pretend otherwise. I want to see Trident removed from Scotland as quickly as is safely possible. The timetable for that will of course require careful negotiation with the Westminster Government. We set out a desired timescale for that as being the first Parliament of an independent Scotland, but safety has to be absolutely paramount, and therefore it will require very careful negotiation and discussion. I want to see the back of Trident. I don't want to see the closure of Faslane, and we don't want to see the closure of Faslane. We want to see Faslane continue as a military base within Scotland. We want to see all of our current military bases continue. What we want to see is Faslane become a conventional naval base, and also the headquarters of our three armed forces, the joint headquarters of our Army, Navy and Air Force. Now, that will take a process of reconfiguration of the base. There will be a period of time, of course, while we're negotiating the removal of Trident, where there will continue to be significant numbers of people employed by the UK government, and we will require a transition to the configuration of Faslane in that form. When Faslane is in that form, our estimate, as a result of very careful consideration and work that we've done around this, is that Faslane will support, broadly speaking, the same employment level as it does now as the home of Trident. And that, for this town, is an important thing to hear, because I understand the economic importance of Faslane, and that's got to be recognised, as well as recognising the continuing military contribution that Faslane as a base can make. So we want to see the back of Trident, and we do that on principle grounds and on very practical and financial grounds. I don't think, even if you take away all of the other objections people have to Trident, that as a country we can afford the replacement of Trident at a cost of £100 billion over a generation. But I want to see the Faslane base have an ongoing, continuing place in the military and armed forces of an independent Scotland.
was the second biggest infrastructure project ever in Britain. This would this be replicated in England or Wales? So my question is, who would pay for this? Would this be an independent Scotland, or would it be the UK government that pays for this?
Okay. Gentleman back.
It's a question about defence, which you touched on in your last answer, but as an undecided voter that's swaying towards yes, but as a serving member of the Royal Navy, in an ideal world, post-independence, I would be able to transfer from the Royal Navy to the Scottish Navy and continue to work in Translane, which would give stability for my family, etc. But with all the best will in the world, by Easter 2016, we won't be able to stand up a Scottish military. It will take time. So I'm wondering what work has been put into the transitional arrangements for defence, particularly with the defence capabilities of Scotland, particularly naval, including things like fishing protection, coast guard, etc. And any of this work looked at the transferring of personnel that wish to stay in the Scottish military without risking losing their jobs or being forced to move down to the rest of the UK.
Okay, thank you very much. And a chap right at the back, yeah.
So I read something from about.
Yeah, you're okay.
Yeah, so I read something about Margot MacDonald, that apparently she was worried about MI5 trying to interfere with this referendum. How can we trust them not to tamper with the ballot boxes?
On the first question about Faslane, Coolport, the replication of a home for Trident elsewhere in the UK, I mean, I'll put my cards on the table. I would personally like to see Westminster take the opportunity of Scottish independence to make the decision not to renew Trident, but that's a decision for the Westminster government. We saw a report published just last week actually by a military think tank that suggested that the cost of rehoming Trident somewhere else would not be as significant as had previously been considered. So there was some quite interesting observations and analysis there. In terms of the cost of that, I mean, clearly these things will be subject to negotiation. Scotland has been the host of Trident for a long period of time. I think the starting point would be if the Westminster government wants to rehouse Trident somewhere else, then the obligation for that would rest principally with them. But of course these will be matters of negotiation that we enter into as constructively as possible. Gentleman who asked me a question about Royal Navy, if you want to catch me, I'm going to answer your question, but there's a lot more detail I can point you to in terms of the work we've done. If you want to catch me at the end and give me your details, I'd be happy to send you an email tomorrow with some links to some of the detailed work we've done about the transition and the phasing of moving to Scottish Defence Forces and the period of time during which we will build up to full complement of Defence Forces. We will start as an independent country. Remember, there is a period of time between Scotland voting yes in September, if that is what we do, and becoming independent in March 2016. We will require to have core military capability in place, both in terms of the government capability and also the military capability to ensure the proper defence of the country, and that is particularly relevant, in my view, to naval forces because of the fact we are a maritime country with a big coastline, oil installations, a fishing industry. So we will require those core capabilities and then build up over a period of time to full capacity. There will also, during a transition period, be UK forces continuing to be based in Scotland, and longer term, as an aside, we would be very open to continued joint working in terms of joint basing, joint procurement, for example. We will very much welcome serving members of the British Armed Forces, should they wish to do so, to transfer into Scottish Armed Forces. There will be no compulsion on anybody to do so, but we will be very much in the business of recruitment and I hope offering good and attractive terms and conditions and career progression for people who wish to do so. But if you want, as I say, to catch me at the end, I'm very happy to point you to some further, more detailed analysis of that will hopefully answer your particular questions and give you some more assurance around your particular circumstances, and I'd be happy to do any follow-ups on the back of that as well. Third question on Margaret MacDonald, who is sadly missed, I have to say, in the nationalist independence movement. Her husband, Jim Sillars, is currently touring the country in what he's called the Margot Mobile, campaigning for a yes vote and getting a great response wherever he goes. On the issue of the integrity of the ballot, let me say absolutely clearly and unequivocally that I have no concerns about the integrity of the ballot. I am absolutely confident that the referendum we have will be carried out to the highest standards, and the result of the referendum, clearly one side or another is not going to like that result very much, but we will all be able to have confidence in the integrity of that result. I was the Minister in the Scottish Government that took the referendum bill through Parliament. It's now the Referendum Act that governs the conduct of the referendum, the procedures for registering people to vote, for ensuring that votes are properly cast and counted, the procedures for how the result is declared, the procedures for ensuring that the campaign is run fairly on both sides. So, please do not, if you're a yes supporter, and I know not everybody in the room, I hope not everybody in the room is a yes supporter, I hope I'm trying to convince some of you to become yes supporters, but if you're a yes supporter, over the next 4 weeks, don't waste any time worrying about the integrity of the ballot. Just spend all your time getting out there convincing people to vote yes in the ballot.
What the gentleman was saying at the back there was very, very interesting. I think it's a really important issue for this area, and perhaps it's something that we could get the links to as well, and we could put on the Yes Helensburgh Homes Facebook page, which will be publicly available for anyone.
Much of the detail is laid out in the government's white paper, which some of you will have the opportunity to see, others may not, but there's a very detailed chapter on defence and on the transition to independent defence forces and the phasing of that. So even for people who just want to go on and have a look at that, it's certainly worth reading it.
So we'll make sure that's available as widely as possible. We'll go with the gentleman there, and then the chap right in the centre with the glasses, and then the chap there. Okay.
Well, no doubt about the integrity of the ballot. I have some doubts about the integrity of some of the arguments that are being put. I've been in defence of shipbuilding for 43 years, so I know something of what I'm talking about. I've been in defence of shipbuilding for more than 40 years. I know something about what I'm talking about. Why does the SNP persist in claiming that there will be no impact on naval shipbuilding after independence, when this is clearly not the case? And this false assumption is further undermined now by statements from various SNP NMSPs who say that there are no shipyards in England or in the rest of the UK capable of building sophisticated warships. You must know that's not true, with one shipyard being located not 100 miles south of Gretna, and another one just over the North Channel.
Okay, thank you very much. The gentleman there, can we just get a microphone to the chap here? We'll take you in a moment, sir. The gentleman has a microphone at the moment. Do you want to just go now?
I've been hearing about the future of the fast lane and all, but I'm just want to know what's going to be happening with the smaller depots that are around the place, because there's nothing ever mentioned of the smaller depots like Clowder was, Beath, or anything like that. Because there's a lot of people speaking in the world that are paranoid that they're going to lose their jobs. It's all seems like they talk about fast lane, but the smaller municipal depots, there's nothing ever been mentioned about them.
Okay, thank you. Feedback on that. The gentleman there.
Can you answer some concerns about the process of negotiation in the event of a yes vote for Scotland? Who will actually conduct the discussions with the Westminster government on Scotland's behalf? More importantly, who would actually negotiate on behalf of Westminster, given that there could be a change of government after the next general election in the UK?
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Sir, firstly, you've got 40 years of experience in naval shipbuilding, and I wouldn't presume to suggest I know anywhere near as much as you do, or certainly not more than you do. My claim to know something about this industry comes from years I spent being the MSP for Govan Shipyard, and came to know the yard and the operation of the yard and the people who work in the yard and who ran the yard fairly well during that time. Unfortunately, the bureaucrats at the Boundary Commission redrew the boundaries, so I no longer represent the shipyard. But it's an issue and an industry that, while we may disagree, I hope you will accept I care very, very deeply about, and therefore it's an industry that I pay great attention to, look very carefully at the issues and the arguments. Govan Shipyard is likely to close, regardless of the decision about independence. You know, I get slightly angry when I hear, not you sir, but people in the No campaign saying independence is a threat to shipyards. The same people who are presiding over the likely closure of Govan Shipyard within the next few years. Operation in one yard at Scotstoun, but my confidence in the Clyde, if we can use that term, comes down to the skills, the quality of the facilities, the record of productivity and delivery of contracts that the Clyde can boast. And what I will absolutely say and stand by is that the UK government couldn't build these ships in another shipyard elsewhere in the UK without very, very significant additional expenditure to reconfigure those yards. And why would they choose to do that when they have a facility on the Clyde that they have already admitted, in their view, is the best place to build these ships, particularly in a time when joint procurement between different countries is becoming more normal? At a time when an independent Scotland would be seeking to procure some of the very vessels that we're talking about, so there would be an opportunity for joint procurement there. It wouldn't make any sense for additional expenditure to be incurred by UK government in times of austerity, in times when the defence budget is being cut, when the best place to build these ships is right there on the Clyde. And I've got great confidence in the ability of the Clyde, not only now but in the future, to continue to be the best place to do them. I have another view, which you may or may not agree with, that longer term we need to think beyond naval procurement if we're going to secure the future of the shipyard as it will be then for the long term. But that's another issue. I've got huge confidence in the Clyde and the ability to continue to build these vessels. Sir, your question about not just Vaseline but other facilities, our starting point is that we want to protect all of the military and defence facilities that we will inherit at the point Scotland becomes independent. We've seen a reduction in military installations and defence bases over the past few years. We consider that what exists in Scotland we require for the servicing of our armed forces. I obviously don't know particularly what you do, particularly where you work, but if you want to catch me at the end and tell me that, if you don't want to tell me in front of everybody, then I'm happy to kind of give you some more detail about your specific workplace and what our thinking is about that in the future. Third question about negotiation. As I said a moment ago, there will be a period of 18 months as Scotland votes yes before we become independent, when we will enter a process of negotiation with the Westminster Government. From the Scottish perspective, that negotiation will be led by the Scottish Government. We're the democratically elected government of Scotland at the moment, but we've made very clear we would want to widen the ambit of that. You know, I think it's very important after the referendum that we unite as a country, whatever the result. And if it's a yes, I think it would be very important for the negotiation to include people who had been on the no side of this campaign, people in other political parties, people in no political parties, wider civic Scotland. So we've said that we will lead those negotiations as we would have a duty to do, but we will try to take them forward on what we've called a Team Scotland basis. Obviously, who negotiates for Westminster is a matter for Westminster. I if I was advising them, which I'm not, and they wouldn't take my advice even if I was trying to, I guess it would make sense for them to try to do it on a cross-party basis as well, which would take account of the point that you rightly make, that there will be a general election a few months after the referendum, but who negotiates for Westminster would be a matter for the Westminster government at the time to determine, but we will ensure, from the Scottish perspective, it's taken forward in as inclusive a way as possible.
Thank you, Nicola. And we get a microphone just halfway up. Look, I'll come to you in a second, so this gentleman here, then yourself, we'll come to you.
I'm John Black, the leader of the Scottish Jacobite Party. The Jacobite standard was raised at Glenfinnan yesterday.
Yeah. Could we keep it to a question, sir, please?
A couple of weeks ago, Nicola, you stated in defence of a written constitution that an independent Scotland sovereignty would lie with the people of Scotland. On those terms, we cannot be members of the European Union, and we cannot use the British pound. In that case, we be dictated by Brussels and London. So far, the debate has been about both of these issues, as it created problems and a lot of uncertainty. We need solutions, not problems. We need to address the banking situation, the tax situation. Tax avoidance should become tax evasion. We should keep Dryden and build Westminster.
Okay, I think I will move on if you don't mind.
A final point.
Again,
Friday, Ferguson's shipyard closed. How's that against the Scottish shipbuilding and the Clyde?
Okay, thank you. Gentleman there.
Hello, Nicola. From Yes Clyde. One of the core principles that why I'm campaigning for Scottish independence is I firmly believe in a constitution that enshrined in the heart of it will be the intolerance and the principle of the eradication of poverty and protection of the welfare state and the National Health Service. I'm just wondering, you as a lawyer, is that possible and will that be on the agenda?
Thank you.
Madam, can you guess how it feels like to be an English person listening to this assembly going on? I came here a lifetime ago and spent a very happy lifetime here, mainly teaching at universities, also working for the Scottish economy. And I've got the impression that you don't care a damn about what English say. Any consultation with them. I mean, these are people. I've got a large number of.
Please let the gentleman finish.
I've got large numbers of Scottish friends, and a lot of them still feel the same way as I do. Their opinions have been ignored. Now, I don't know what is causing this, but I hope you'll do something to rectify it, because it will help your own cause as well as our own.
Thank you very much.
John, we take different views on certain things, which is absolutely legitimate in a democracy, and that's one of the wonderful things about this campaign is we're getting to debate these things that otherwise we might not be debating in the way that we are with as many people interested. I fundamentally disagree that because you're in the European Union or share a currency, you're not an independent sovereign country. In the modern world, the modern interconnected world, independent sovereign countries choose to pool their sovereignty in a range of different ways if it's in their best interest. France and Germany are both in the European Union, they share a currency, but they are equally both independent sovereign countries. The difference between being independent and being as Scotland is just now is it becomes our decision when we choose to pool sovereignty with others and when we don't, and that I think is better than the position we're in just now, where what powers we have and don't have as a country and as a parliament is decided by Westminster. But long may we continue to have these democratic debates and differences of opinion. I agree with you incidentally about tax avoidance. I think we should be doing more about tax avoidance and certainly tax evasion. People should pay the taxes they're due, and one of the reasons why so many people seem to find so many loopholes to avoid paying tax is the very, very complex nature of the UK tax system, one of the most complicated systems in the world. So maybe there's an opportunity there over time to have a simpler tax system that has fewer places for people to hide and avoid paying the tax that they're due. I am a passionate believer that countries should have written constitutions, because I think as citizens we've all got the right to know what our rights and responsibilities are in relationship to the state. The UK is certainly the only country in Europe, and I think one of very few countries in the world that doesn't have a written constitution, and I would want to see an independent Scotland have one. Countries around the world increasingly enshrine in their written constitution not just the more traditional constitutional rights that are associated with constitutions, like freedom of speech and religion and what the voting system is and how the government's held to account, protection for human rights. All these things are fundamentally important, but increasingly some countries seek to enshrine more social and economic rights in constitutions as well. So the right to employment, the right to healthcare, the right to education. I would hope that an independent Scotland would take the opportunity to do that and to follow those examples. One of the reasons I believe so passionately in independence is about giving us the ability to solve, not overnight, but over time, some of the deep-seated inequalities that exist in our society. A constitution won't do that on its own, but it does give you the opportunity to set your priorities down very clearly and then galvanise the whole of your society to try to deliver them. So it's a fantastic opportunity that I hope we would take. It wouldn't be for the Scottish Government to write the Constitution, incidentally. We've got ideas as to what should be in it, but that process would be more inclusive than just a government. Sir, your question in some ways pains me deeply, and I want to just take the opportunity to hopefully reassure you. My grandmother was English, so I'm a quarter English, I've got lots of English family. My view firstly of who has a right to a say in the future of Scotland is not about whether you're Scottish or whether you can trace your family tree back generations in Scotland. It's if you live here. If you've chosen to make this country your home, it doesn't matter where you come from, and this is your home, sir, as much as it is my home, which is why it pains me to hear you express the view that you did, and I'm genuinely sorry that that's how you feel, and I accept a responsibility to try to help change how you feel. For me, this is to some extent a personal view, and it's shaped by my own family experience, shaped a bit by my constituency experience. I represent the south side of Glasgow, and if I was to, I wouldn't, because they would probably think I was off my head, but if I was to stop people randomly in the streets of my constituency and say, what's your national identity? People are as likely to say Pakistani, Indian, Polish, Irish, as they are to say Scottish, English, British. So for me, this debate is not about national identity. It's about all of us who choose to make Scotland our home, being able to decide what kind of home, what kind of country we want it to be. Nor is it about turning our back on other parts of the British Isles. An independent Scotland is still going to be part of the British Isles. We're not being sawn off and kind of floated into the North Atlantic somewhere. We're going to be part of the British Isles. We're still going to be part of that family that make up the British Isles. And the connections that bind us, the family connections that I have a personal attachment to, the connections of history, of tradition, of culture, these things run much, much deeper than politics or how a country is governed. They're about people, and those links can't be broken, and they shouldn't be broken. And I feel very, very strongly and very passionately about that. But more than anything, I feel passionately that everybody who lives in this country, regardless of where they come from, has a stake in making this country the best it can be, and we should all do that together. So, I hope over time, if not tonight, I can help to make you feel differently to the way you've expressed your views this evening.
Can I return to the currency question, please? I hear what you said about the idea that the other local parties are telling fibs that they don't want a currency union. But I think in the context of what's happened in recent years over the Eurozone, between powerful countries like Germany and countries in the southern periphery, the idea that the rest of the UK will enter into a currency union with Scotland, which is a country which is going to have a significant oil industry relative to the rest of the UK, just isn't going to work. To me, it would be a more honest response if you were to reconcile yourself to the possibility that other people might not be lying when they say this, and come up with an alternative plan, which seems to me might well be, if you're going to join the euro, we join the euro to be in the euro. That's a reasonable approach to take. I don't understand why you wouldn't accept it.
Okay,
there isn't an asset to the Bank of England. The Bank of England doesn't belong to part of Scotland.
Okay, gentleman there.
Hi. The question about the policing in this country. Stations are actually closed, and the Bartonshire alone is disgusting. But at the weekends, the only police station you can get is Clydebank. Now, this is absolutely scandalous for this independent Scotland. Will you open up all the police stations? Will you give us a better police force? And how about that? How will I go?
Okay, thank you. And the gentleman in the balcony. Oh, sorry, the lady in the balcony, sorry.
There's been a lot of discussion on the oil industry and the renewables, and obviously in independent Scotland we need to strive for a strong economy. Can you give us any assurances that that won't be at any cost, and that we'd still be able to protect our marine protected areas, our wild land, and face up to the challenges of processes like fracking, the Donald Trumps of this world?
Okay, so your question on currency, I mean, I don't want to get into an argument about whether the Bank of England's an asset. I think it clearly is an asset. It holds nearly a third of all the UK's debt. It's a nationalised institution, it's a shared asset, but that's not the central point you were making. We have set out the alternative options to a currency union. I referred to the work that was done that set out those options, that looked at them all, the ups and the downs, the pros and the cons, and that's publicly available for anybody to look at if you so want. So those options are there, and there's transparency around that, but we will argue what we think is in the best interest of Scotland. And I came into politics, when I came into politics, to argue the best options for Scotland, not to be forced into arguing second best options, and I believe what we're putting forward is the best option. I don't accept that a currency union between Scotland and England is the same as the euro. The problem, and I'm going to oversimplify horribly here, but in the interest of time I will do it, the central problem with the euro was that it tried to combine the richest parts of Germany with the poorest parts of Greece. The UK, in terms of Scotland and England, are not in that position. We are what is known in economic terms as an optimal currency area in terms of the similarities in our levels of employment and productivity. So the inherent weaknesses in the euro don't apply to the kind of currency union that we're talking about. I don't, and the Scottish Government doesn't favour going into the euro because of some of the issues that we think are wrong with the euro. We can't be forced into the euro as an independent country. Some of the conditions for euro entry, and you have to meet conditions to get into the euro, it's not an automatic thing. Some of those conditions, like membership of the European exchange rate mechanism for 2 years, are entirely voluntary on the part of countries. Sweden is an example of a country that joined the EU after the requirement to join the euro was in the treaties. They're not in the euro, so you can't be forced in. So I don't believe it would be in Scotland's interest to go into the euro. I believe it's in our interest to have a currency union. I believe the conditions for a currency union are right. I believe there are very good reasons why it's in the interest of the rest of the UK. So that's what I will continue to argue. But the other options are there for people to see and assess if they want to, and there's perfect transparency around that. In terms of the question on the police, policing is a devolved responsibility. It's the responsibility of the Scottish Government. So if you have concerns or complaints about that, then you're certainly directing them at the right government here, and I'll not try to shirk that in any way. We took a decision as a government a few years back that given the constraints on public funding, we wanted to make sure we could support as many police officers on the streets of Scotland as possible. And we took the decision to go to a single police force in order to reduce some of what we consider to be unnecessary duplication of costs in the police and give us much resource as possible to the front line. And I'm proud that we have sustained and are determined to continue to sustain 1,000 extra police officers on the street, which is one of the things that's helping to deliver the situation we live in just now, where we've got a record low, I think a 30-odd year low in recorded crime in this country. So I know there have been issues in some parts of Scotland about changes to the hours of police offices, closure of front counters, and I know all of that is difficult for local communities, but the determination of the government has been to support frontline policing on the streets, bobbies on the beat, and that's what our thrust very much is. But I'll certainly report back to the Justice Secretary when I see him tomorrow the comments that you've raised this evening, and I'm sure he'll want to reflect on that. The question from the balcony, we as a government believe in sustainable economic growth, and the word sustainable is in there for a reason. No country should go for economic growth regardless of the cost to its people or to its environment. Economic growth has to be sustainable. I think the fact that the Scottish Government is not the favoured government of Donald Trump these days probably gives you some evidence that we don't necessarily just go for growth or development at all costs. We took a different view to Donald Trump on wind farms, for example, and the evidence of that is there to see. We also take a much more cautious view of fracking than the UK government is doing. The UK government seems hell-bent on going ahead with fracking, giving licences to companies, regardless of the concerns about the environment. I mean, last week we heard that they want to allow companies to frack underneath people's houses and give the householder no right to complain or object to that, which just seems to me absolutely unacceptable. So we do take a cautious, precautionary view to development to make sure that we are properly protecting our economy, our marine environment, and the things about our environment that help to make Scotland as special as I think we are.
Just hold it closer, please.
I've been in this country 29 years, never had a little bit of bother anybody. A gentleman down there who sat, I couldn't understand his question. I would think the problem is not with English people, but with Westminster, which Nicola agree with us.
My vote for yes is based on the lack of democracy that we have. We currently have in the UK 760 unelected peers. I want to know what a Scottish Government will look like in the future. I want to know that my vote not only will but I won't be able to just elect my government, I'll be able to elect anybody who has the power.
Thank you. I won't even dignify a bit about English with any kind of comment with an accent like mine, but I'm proud to be a Scot, proud to live in Scotland. I'm proud to be given the vote in this particular referendum. And I have to say, proud as well of the government's decision not to extend that vote to expats. If we live here, we have the right to vote. But it's really on two issues. One, as we go forward into the debate now in the last month, as the media has been reminding us today, there are two angles to that which I would like really an assurance that we'll start to emphasise that. I see it in a lot of the literature, but I think it should come out more in the media. One is the richness of a country does not actually come down to its monetary wealth. It's much more than money. As any family life will tell you, it's not just about whether you're rich. It's much wider than that. And I think any country that can take great pride in youngsters trundling around with tonnets tea cakes on their heads. And I think we have a lot to promote as part of our cultural wealth and also our wealth as a nation. And the richness of the country is not just about money, and we should try and get away from the debate being led down the pound.
Okay.
The other thing is, I don't think...
Very, very quickly, please.
I don't think we've emphasised the success story since devolution. And I think one of the things we should be looking at, democracy near to home, and the NHS, for example, is a great success story north of the border when you compare it with England. And my real question is, Nicola, if there is any chance at all of you getting on a platform with Alistair Darling, will you please say yes?
Nicola has very kindly agreed to go on a little bit later than 8:30, but we are running definitely short on time. If you do want to get a question, please let me know. I see the gentleman at the back, so we've probably got another 2 batches of questions after this, so please let me know. Nicola?
First question, sir, you're absolutely 100% correct. I couldn't agree with you more. This referendum is not about England. I love England, I love English people. It's not about England or English people at all. It's about whether Scotland wants to be governed by Westminster or not. That's the issue we've got to decide. Democracy is at the heart of this. Let me answer that question in 2 ways. One I've already touched on. It cannot be democratic that we get governed by governments at Westminster that we've rejected. Now, none of us individually always get the governments we vote for. There'll be people in this room that never voted for the SNP, but you've got an SNP government in Holyrood. But with the government in Holyrood, because we won the election, fair and square. The Conservatives are in power right now at Westminster. They didn't win the election in Scotland. Now that is not democratic. So being independent means we get the governments we vote for. And the second point I want to make is, because I'm standing here as an SNP politician, answering many of these questions that you're asking me about life in an independent Scotland with reference to SNP policies. That's all I can do. I can't speak for other parties. But we might not have an SNP government in an independent Scotland. That will be down to you and how people vote. I hope we'll get an SNP government. I'll certainly be back in 2016 campaigning for an SNP government, but it will be up to how people vote. That's democracy. And being able, as a country, to determine our own government, I think is the fundamental tenet of democracy in any country, and it's one of the big arguments that I have. Very nice to see you again. I haven't crossed paths with you as much as I used to when I was Health Secretary. I totally agree with you. Economic wealth is of course important. We need to pay the bills and we need to provide the standard of living and the public services for people. But for any country, the financial and economic aspects of well-being are only part of it. I talked earlier on about how small countries tended to be the richest countries in the world, and I was then talking about economic wealth. But some of these same countries also top the league tables of happiness. Believe it or not, the happiness of countries is measured. And these small countries are also the happiest countries, the countries with the greatest sense of well-being. So a country's wealth is more about money. It's about our values, the fairness of our society, our cultural health, how we carry ourselves, how we feel about ourselves, our confidence. All of that is vitally important, and I believe in all of these respects. An independent Scotland, a confident independent Scotland, wouldn't look back in terms of becoming a really happy, prosperous place for people to live. Your point about devolution, I am always happy to extol the virtues of the achievements of devolution. It won't surprise you to know, given my time as Health Secretary, that I think the NHS is right up there. It's not perfect. The NHS has always got to be looking to improve, but I'm very proud of our NHS. I'm certainly proud that we're able to protect it from the kind of privatisation that we're seeing in the health service. One last point on that though, because the NHS is a devolved responsibility. We take the policy decisions about our health service. But what's happening in England right now does pose a threat to our health service. Be under no illusion. The health service has been privatised in England. Now, as more private money starts to fund the health service in England, then you'll see a reduction in the amount of public money that's funding the health service in England. Now, why does that matter for us? Because right now how we're funded through the Barnett formula means that reductions in spending, public spending in England, trigger an automatic reduction in spending in Scotland. You know, if spending on the health service in England reduces by £100 million, say, we get an automatic 10% cut of that in Scotland. So if over the next few years, as looks to be the case, public funding for the health service is going to decline in England in favour of private funding, that's going to hit our budget hard, and that's going to make it harder for us to protect our health service. So if we want to protect our health service and be sure we can do it, we need to get control of our own resources.
When the bell rings, that you all decide you want to ask questions. So if you get a chance, Nicole, please make it as quickly as you can. The lady there, the gentleman right in the middle, and then the lady at the end of the row here.
Scotland has achieved a great deal as part of the Union. You mentioned all the sheep, penicillin, etc. To take a leap forward into independence requires a great deal of trust and faith. For me, it's very difficult that we seem to be getting conflicting answers, even on things as simple as who subsidises who, do we subsidise the rest of the UK, do they subsidise us? And a lot of it seems to come down to trust, and that's very difficult to make that decision. You require that kind of trust, and it comes down to what you believe, essentially. There seems to be a real lack of hard facts for me and a lot of others.
Okay, thank you very much. Gentlemen, right at the back.
Hello, Nicola. As somebody still on the fence, you convince me about my pension. I've got a civil service pension. Is it safe? You tell me.
Okay. Lady there. Thank you for your brevity, sir. We'll follow suit.
I mentioned tonight, and that is education. I've looked at the white paper, and as an ex-teacher, I'm quite excited by what's set out about preschool childcare. Could you please elucidate a little bit on that, and in particular for the advantages of women in our society? Thank you.
Okay, the lady at the back, believe it or not, I understand that frustration. You listen to somebody like me on one side, you listen to somebody else on the other side, and you inevitably think, who do I believe? What I can tell you is what I've told you tonight in terms of Scotland's wealth, the fact we're one of the richest countries in the world. That's not my facts and figures. These are, objectively verifiable facts and figures. But I guess what I would say in response to your perfectly understandable question is this: don't trust politicians, trust yourselves. And I mean that in two ways. Firstly, trust your own intelligence to kind of cut through the political debate and make up your own mind about what you think is right and wrong about Scotland, the country you live in. And secondly, trust yourself in terms of the ability that you have, that all of us have, to run this country better than anybody else can. We cannot be, surely, the only country on the face of the planet that doesn't have what it takes to make the right decisions, to make better decisions about the future of our country. We are one of the wealthiest countries on this planet. I fundamentally have confidence, huge amounts of confidence, bags of confidence in the future of this country as an independent nation, because I have confidence in the talents and the skills of the people who live here. And if we marry that to the wealth we've got as a country, then we will not look back. We will have our challenges, of course we will. We'll have our ups and downs. It won't all be plain sailing. Show me the corners of the world where it ever is. But we'll be able to take the decisions that shape our country, and we will do it better than anybody else ever will. So if you don't trust politicians, that's fine. Trust yourself. And if you put your trust in yourself, yes, sir, your pension is safe. We, as the Scottish Government, have given the absolute guarantee that pensions, in terms of state pensions, your pension as a public sector worker is safe and guaranteed. We will honour the obligations to pay your pension, as we absolutely should, because you have paid into your pension and you're entitled to get the pension that you've paid for. The advantage of being independent when it comes to pensions is, I suppose, the same as it is anywhere else. We get to take the decisions that determine pensions policy. As a public sector worker, you will know about the assault on your pension over recent years, your increased contributions, having to work longer to get it. If you're a woman in particular in this country, or any part of the UK, you've seen your pension age go up from 60 to 66 in less than a decade. People, as we are right now, are being expected to work longer for less. I think we should get to take the decisions about when people retire and what they are entitled to receive when they retire. But the pension entitlements that people have accrued will be honoured in full. And I don't think anybody on either side of this debate should be seeking to scare, particularly older people, about their pension. Pensions in an independent Scotland are more affordable because pension payments, social protection payments, which include pensions, actually take up a smaller proportion of our economy, of our tax revenues as a country, than is the case in the UK. So we will pay pensions, your pension will be secure, and into the bargain you'll get to decide for the future what the best pensions policy is for the country, and I think that's a good deal all round. Lastly, on childcare, I'm glad you asked the question about childcare. We want to, I'm talking about the SNP here, if we were the government in an independent Scotland, we want to dramatically increase childcare provision so that children from age 1 to 5 get the same amount of hours every week in childcare as children get in primary school. Now, why do we want to do that? Well, firstly, I think there's a lot of evidence that that's good for children's development, but secondly, it's good for parents who want to go back to work. Particularly women who want to go back to work. Now, not all women will want to go back to work after they have children, but if you do, then right now, when we face some of the highest childcare costs in Europe, that can be very difficult. So we want to make it easier for women to go back to work. Why is that important? Because not only can they provide better for their families, but women in work, anybody in work, pays taxes, they pay national contributions, national insurance contributions. They buy more, they pay more VAT, the revenues of the country increase as a result. And that increase in revenue is what makes a transformational childcare policy affordable over the long term. Now, right now, if we increase childcare the way we are funding in Scotland, and that gets more people into work, the added taxes that these people pay go straight to the Treasury in London. And we don't see very much of it, if any of it. If we're independent and control over our spending and our revenues, control of both sides of our balance sheet, which any family and business would inherently understand, then we can invest in policies like childcare, knowing that the added increased revenues from that come back to allow us to make that sustainable. So that's a massive opportunity that opens up to us if we vote yes and become independent.
Hands up, so these are the last ones, and as I trust you, please keep your questions brief and to the point. So we're going to go in order, so be aware. The gentleman there, and then we'll go up to the balcony, to the centre balcony, then we'll come down here, then we'll go back up to the balcony, the gentleman at the far side, and we'll finish with the lady dead centre in front of the doors. Okay? So.
Nicola, you talk about wind power and manpower. Will we actually start seeing an independent Scotland, our bills coming down, like gas and electricity bills, and our fuel prices at the petrol pumps, will their bills come down then?
Okay, thank you very much. Second question? Nice and close.
As a student, I was just wondering how realistic it is to promise the continuation of having free university and college education.
Okay, lovely, thank you very much. Lady over here.
As a member of the Scottish Youth Parliament for this area, part of my job is to help register and inform young people enough to vote. I was just wondering how the Scottish Government are looking to support all of our young and first-time voters coming to this room.
Okay, thank you. Gentlemen, can we get a microphone over here, please?
In the event of a yes vote.
Or, yeah, we've got a microphone to you.
In the event of a yes vote, the sea border of Berwick, will you ask for it to be returned to us? Because Westminster is the Scottish Parliament being set up.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, the lady right in front of the doors.
Hello, Nicola. I'm on a 52% of the population, and I'm just wondering, I've been campaigning all my adult life for equality for women who still don't even have equal pay. So in an independent Scotland, is there some policies you have got that's going to make equality for women high on the agenda?
We'll take a deep breath. Right, fuel bills and electricity bills. Well, the short answer to your question is we get powers over regulation of fuel bills, energy, if we become independent. We, and again I'm talking about the SNP, we've got two specific things we would seek to do in each of these areas. We favour what's called a fuel duty regulator, which means that as the cost of oil goes up, there's a kind of stabilisation mechanism so that the price of fuel is not going up as the revenue that governments get is increasing, because much of a ridiculous amount of what you pay for a litre of petrol in the filling station goes in tax. So as oil prices go up, the government's revenue goes up, and we suggest a stabilisation mechanism to ensure that fuel prices hold in check as well. Secondly, with electricity bills, your household energy bills, a proportion of your energy bills right now are levied by energy companies to allow them to fulfil obligations that they've got to put energy efficiency measures into people's houses. Now, we think these things shouldn't be funded through energy bills. Government should centrally fund energy efficiency schemes. It also means it's easier to do. It's a more progressive way of doing it rather than having that falling on energy bills. And if you took those elements of the energy bill off of the energy bill, you would take our average energy bill down by about £70 a year, which is not a king's ransom, but in days of rising bills, it's something that I think most people would welcome. So these are specific policies in both of these areas, but they're both things right now that we can't do because power lies elsewhere. Second question about tuition fees. I'll try not to go on too long in this because this is an issue that is very, very close to my heart, as it will be to many people in here. I believe very, very passionately in free education. And it's kind of personal because, I got the benefit of a university education. If I'd had to pay tuition fees, I grew up in a working class family in Ayrshire. If I'd had to pay tuition fees, I wouldn't have gone to university. Not because my mum and dad wouldn't have strived very hard to help me get to university, but it wouldn't have been a practical proposition. But the fact I got access to free education is one of the big reasons why I'm able to stand here right now as the Deputy First Minister of the country. And having had access to free education and being the Deputy First Minister, I've got no right to take that away from generations of young people. I will fight tooth and nail for as long as I'm in politics, and I'll never ever be part of a government that reneged on free education because it's so important, in my view, to tackling inequality and allowing everybody to get on in life. Now, we deliver that policy already. There's no reason why we can't continue to fund that policy. We fund it already. Just very briefly, you may have heard discussion about when we're independent, would we be able to continue doing what we reluctantly do just now, which is charge students who come from other parts of the UK to study here tuition fees. Now, I wish we didn't have to do that. We have to do that because Westminster charges some tuition fees, and if we didn't, then we'd have a danger of our students being crowded out of our universities. If 10% of English students came to Scotland to escape tuition fees, that would take up 80% of our places. Now, we want students from England to come to study here, but we need to also be able to protect places for students here at home. We believe we can continue to do that. If Westminster ever get rid of tuition fees, we wouldn't want to do it, but as long as we have to, we believe we can because of what's known in European jargon as objective justification. If you can show an objective justification for something that would otherwise conflict with European law, then you can sustain that position. And we believe the position that I've just outlined about protecting places allows us to make that objective justification, and that's why I'm confident that we can continue to protect, as I would always want us to do, that policy of free education. Question about young people and electoral registration. The Scottish Youth Parliament does a great job on these issues. The responsibility for electoral registration lies with the Electoral Commission, not with the Scottish Government. And the responsibility for ensuring that young people who are still at school are getting access to the information and on both sides in school lies with Education Scotland. The Scottish Government, I don't know if you were there, we held a youth cabinet session a couple of months back when we had young people from all over Scotland get the opportunity to come to a session like this, although it was a bit funkier because it was young people, to question the cabinet, to ask the kind of questions that you're asking, and that was really successful. And it's the kind of thing we're trying to do to make sure that young people have the information they need. But obviously, we're on one side of the debate, and it's important that young people get information on both sides. Sea border, a precise border would be a matter of negotiation, but these things are determined, or at least the very strong starting point for these things is international law, which determines the territory and the maritime border of any country. And we would be absolutely determined that Scotland got fairness in that respect. And of course, the principal consideration there is our oil and gas. And by any stretch of international law, the vast bulk of oil and gas reserves lie in Scottish waters, which will give us the ability to make sure we steward that resource well for the future. And lastly, I also part of the 52% of the population, so these are important matters. Right now, responsibility for equality is reserved to Westminster. So we're independent, responsibility for promoting equality transfers to the Scottish Parliament. And there's a range of things that I would like to see Scottish governments with responsibility for promoting equality do that we are not able to do right now. You mentioned the Equal Pay Act. The Equal Pay Act was passed in the year I was born, which, as I told you earlier, is no yesterday. And we still have unequal pay. Men and women doing jobs of the same value not getting paid the same. That's a scandal. Now, an independent Scottish Government could set out a clear, timed implementation plan for making sure the Equal Pay Act is implemented. We get responsibility for determining, if we so chose, how we go about getting more women represented in parliaments, on public and private boards of companies and public bodies, so that we don't have that democratic deficit. Being responsible for things like pensions and pension age is not exclusively important to women, but particularly important to women, given the rise in pension age that women in particular have been faced with. Childcare, responsibility and the ability to transform childcare, all of these things, I would argue, help everybody in Scotland, but are of particular importance to women, and it's one of the reasons why I would love us to have the powers to do these things here in Scotland rather than have it left elsewhere. And I guess my final point, since that was the final marathon of questions that Brendan subjected me to there, is just to wrap up by saying that is exactly why I'm standing here tonight asking you to vote yes. Because we're the best ones to decide what kind of country we are and how we go about creating that kind of country. Won't always be easy. I've said several times tonight, it won't all be plain sailing. We'll have our ups and downs, we'll have our challenges. but we'll be the ones with our hands on the decision-making powers, with access to our resources to make sure we're navigating our way through those challenges and doing so in the best interest of this country that we live in. And my final point is, I guess, directed to the undecideds in the audience, people who've yet to make up their mind. There'll be many things that help you make up your mind over the next 4 weeks. Some of you may have a postal vote, so you've only got a week to make up your mind. One of the things I often say to people who are yet to make up their mind is, think how you'll feel the day after the referendum. We've had this wonderful debate as a country, debating things that we maybe never imagined we would ever debate, thinking about what kind of country we want to be. Think about how you'll feel the day after. What's going to make you more optimistic about the future of the country is to know that we've had that wonderful debate about all the possibilities and the potential for independence. We've come so far, but we've just opted to leave things exactly as they are. Or will it be knowing that, yeah, it's a bit scary, yes, it's, maybe a bit uncertain, yes, there'll be a voice in your head saying, am I really doing the right thing? But knowing that we have had the courage, the ambition, the determination to take responsibility for the future of this country into our own hands. I think it's the latter, because when we do that, we will become responsible for building a country that we can be proud of and that we can be proud to leave to wee babies like that one in the audience. And that, in my view, is what it's all about.
Nicola was on her feet. I think you must agree, as Harry Reid said, we have with us the most capable and able politician in British politics. Yes, Helensburgh moment. On your seats there are cards. We would love you to get involved. If you have more questions, we have a shop open in Gahoon Square, as you know. We're open 7 days a week. Come in, get involved, have a cup of tea, ask the questions that you perhaps didn't ask tonight. There's always someone there. On your seat there are cards. If you want to get involved, please fill in your name, address, and give us an email address, and we'll contact you within hours of leaving tonight. There's the merchandise shop is outside. Please feel free to visit. The polls are moving in our direction, and we can make this happen. We saw over the weekend just how tight this is. And if we continue the momentum that we have, then I think on September the 19th, Scotland is going to be changed forever and changed for the better. Thank you very, very much.